Story 1. I don't know if I'd call it supernatural, but it was freaky and I still don't understand. I was in the kitchen cleaning up, waiting for my son's bus. I saw the bus pull up and my son get off. He didn't come in. He had been playing around, hiding under the window to jump out at me and say boo. So I thought that was what he was doing. But when I walked outside, he wasn't there. I called his name and looked around the house thinking he was hiding, but I couldn't find him. I circled the house calling for him and the parent panic set in. Probably only lasted 90 seconds, but it felt a lot longer. Then his bus pulled up and he got off. Story 2. I had a phase in my mid-teens when I would read the obituaries in the local newspaper. I saw a name that was familiar because it was the same as a family friend. It listed his full first, middle, and last names. I did not say anything to my parents because I figured they already knew. A few days later, my mother told me he had died, and I said I knew because I had seen his obituary. She said, "He died last night in his sleep." I went back through the newspapers because my mother kept them for a week before throwing them out, but the obituary was not there. When the real obituary came out, it had his first and last name but only his middle initial. This was nearly 40 years ago, and I still think about it. Story 3. I shared this story a few times on Reddit, but no one seemed to care. I wish I could show people firsthand how bizarre it really was. There's a place in my hometown called Old Town that had to be evacuated because a mine made the area unsafe due to sinkholes and other hazards. In middle school, I took a class called Environmental Adventures that did outdoor activities, and we went to Old Town for geocaching. While the class was walking, we saw an old woman in a rocking chair on a concrete foundation where a house used to be. She was dressed like an old-timey woman, like Muriel from Courage the Cowardly Dog. She rocked back and forth, talking to herself, staring into the woods, never looking at us. We found the geocache a little down the road, turned around, and she and the rocking chair had disappeared. There was no way she could have gotten away that fast, carrying a rocking chair, without us seeing her. We were only at the geocache for about 5 minutes. Confused everybody. The weirdest thing I have ever seen. Story 4. I woke up with a strange feeling and saw an opaque silhouette of a little boy standing across the apartment facing me. When I turned on the light, it disappeared. When I turned the light off, it reappeared. I switched the light back on and went over to check for anything that could have caused a shadow. There was nothing that could have created that specific shape, and it was standing in the path between my couch and the wall, so it could not have been a shadow. I turned the light off again, and it was there. I switched it back on and slept with the light on for the rest of the night. I could not sleep without the light on for days. Story 5. I was biking down a country road I used to live on when I was 8 or 9. On my way home, I saw a small humanoid creature run across the road from one crop field into a cornfield. I still vividly remember that it was completely covered in yellow from neck to feet, and I think it had green on its head. I told my mother about it, and she suggested it might have been a Cabbage Patch Kid. I never saw it again, but I still think about it from time to time. It was the size of a small child, about 50 feet away. Story 6. My cousin had struggled with depression his whole life, and a few years ago things came to a head. He was 100% convinced the only cure for his depression was suicide, that death was the only thing that would make him truly happy. We were close, so it hit pretty hard. After the funeral, my aunt told us she had seen a helium-filled smiley face balloon float in front of her, stop, and just sit there for a minute. Then it floated up and away out of sight on its own. We brushed it off as a coincidence, but it kept happening to her over the next few weeks. A few months later, I was at a music festival when the exact same type of balloon, the same color and everything, floated through my campsite. It stopped on its own, seemed to stare at me, then bobbed and floated up and away. I'm not a believer in ghosts, but I'm convinced in some way that it was my cousin telling us he was finally happy. Story 7. Early in my relationship with my now wife, I had a vivid, prolonged dream about her in childbirth. I spent days in a strange twilight hospital setting, and when it came time to deliver, everything went wrong and both she and the baby died. I woke up shaken but brushed it off. I am a nurse and had dealt with traumatic obstetric situations before, so I assumed I was processing work-related stress. 6 years later, my wife became pregnant. I had forgotten the dream. Late in the third trimester, while I was on shift, I received a call that my wife was going to the emergency room for high blood pressure. I left work and went to meet her. As soon as I stepped into the room, I remembered the dream. It was the same room. That was unsettling because the hospital we were at had not even been built when I had the dream. This was last year, right when the lockdown started. My wife was admitted and the team wanted to wait a week to deliver if possible. She would be kept in a twilight state until then, isolated in that room while the world outside was frozen. My wife was incoherent a few feet away. I tried to manage my anxiety, but the memory of the dream lingered. When it was time to push, the situation matched my dream. Things began to go poorly, and the doctor thought vaginal delivery might still be possible. I panicked and demanded a cesarean section. The doctor hesitated but then reassessed and called for an emergency cesarean section. It took 10 minutes for me to be taken back to the operating room. I saw our baby delivered lifeless, and they worked to resuscitate her. My wife was bleeding heavily and the team scrambled to control it. I followed the baby as she was stabilized and then transported by air to another hospital. Before they left, I saw my wife stable and on her way to the intensive care unit. Both my wife and the baby were critical but alive. Today they are both thriving. Our daughter is 16 months old and a whirlwind of energy. I do not know if they would be alive now if the dream had not caused me to panic and demand a change in the plan. Story 8. My father killed my mother when I was 10. I am now in my mid-30s. 2 years ago, I lost my wedding ring. We looked everywhere. I even played back the security camera at work to see if I was wearing it when I left. I gave up finding it and was very upset. One night, I dreamed my mother woke me and said, "I know you have been looking for this. I love you. It will be out here." The next morning, I was getting ready for work as usual and sat down on the couch. Right in front of me on the ottoman was my ring. I had gone to bed after my wife, and she woke up after me. I had used that ottoman the night before, and there was no way the ring could have been there. We had been robbed once, so we installed a camera pointing at the front door that could see our couch. I checked the footage, and the ottoman had no ring when I went to bed. I still cry occasionally when I remember it. Story 9. Many years ago, my parents had separated and my father was planning to take a trip across the country to California. He was pretty excited about it. I talked to him the day before he left, wished him well, and told him I would talk to him after he got to California. On the day of his trip, he called and told me he had decided at the last minute not to go. He refused to explain why and simply said he had changed his mind. It seemed odd. He had been planning it for months. That night, I was sitting at my girlfriend's house watching the news when they reported that United States Air Flight 1493, the flight my father was supposed to be on, had collided with another aircraft while landing in Los Angeles. About 25% of the people on board were killed. It was hard to know how my father would have fared, because survival depended on where you were sitting, front versus back of the plane. Several months later, he finally told me that the night before he was supposed to leave, he had had an extremely vivid dream that he died in a fiery plane crash, so vivid that it had scared him out of flying that day. My father is a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran who saw combat. I can only imagine how vivid the dream must have been to keep him from getting on that plane. Believe it or not, I had never actually watched Final Destination. Now I have to see it. Story 10. The night before Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I was across the country at my parents' house, driving back to their place with my now wife from a friend's house. As we drew near, there was a bundle in the middle of the road. I stopped and pulled over to move it, and it turned out to be a barred owl that had been clipped by a car. Long story short, I spent the rest of that night getting the owl into a puppy cage, giving it some food and water, and the next day I dropped it off at a wildlife rescue center. I got home the following week, after traveling from New Jersey to Oregon. I stepped outside and there was a barred owl sitting on my fence watching me. He was gone by the time I came back. But now I know I am straight with all owls. Story 11. A friend and I were playing tennis one night at the courts near my house. The lights usually went out at 11 p.m., but that night they went off earlier at 10:43 p.m. We collected our things and started walking to my car, about 500 feet from the courts. My friend's mother pulled up just as we reached my car and asked, "Where have you been?" I called your cell phone and a man was laughing. It did not sound like you. My friend then realized he did not have his phone. He asked his mother to call it again, and we saw it light up on the court where we had been playing, near the net, between the singles lines, not where we had left the rest of our things. He retrieved the phone and it showed only the one missed call from his mother, the call she had just made. Her call log, however, showed 3 calls to his phone that night. We could not explain why the phone had been on the court, what happened with the calls, or why the lights had gone off early. It was surreal. Story 12. I went with my brother to see an old family property our mother had inherited in a very rural area. We were just looking around. It had not been lived in for decades. It was windy and rainy, and my brother and I were inspecting the house when we started hearing a strange rhythmic knocking coming from around the building. The knock came at regular intervals, like a clock, but much louder. We stepped outside to look, but the noise seemed to move away from us until it disappeared. We left shortly afterward. A couple of days later, I stopped by my mother's. I asked if she had any pictures of the original owner of the house, her grandfather, so my great-grandfather. She pulled one out, and it turned out the man had a wooden leg from a war injury. I told my mother about the sound, and she remembered him, saying that was exactly how he sounded when he walked on the porch. It was very strange. It is possible a bird was tapping on wood nearby, but birds that do that tend to tap rapidly. In my experience, the knocks were about 2 seconds apart, which is different from typical animal behavior. I am not into supernatural stuff, but that was eerie. Story 13. This did not happen to me, but a very nice elderly man and his wife lived a few streets over from us. She became very sick, and her son flew in to help care for her. A few weeks later, she entered hospice and died. The night she died, her husband and son drove home. They were discussing funeral arrangements, and the husband asked, "Do you think she would want someone to attend?" They both said they heard the deceased woman in the back seat say, "No, thank you." Story 14. Not a big one, but here it is. When I was 13, I had an incredibly vivid dream with beautiful colors and sunny skies. In part of the dream, 2 bulls were fighting in my house. The fighting was about as scary as a children's book antagonist. I shooed them out and went on my way. After waking, I got ready for school and my mother started driving to town. In the distance, I saw 2 bulls fighting. In the 9 years I lived there, that was the only time I saw it. My story is minor, but I still wonder about it. Story 15. I have an idea of what may have happened, but I cannot definitively say how. My father died in 2000 in my parents' house. One night, I was there late after my mother had gone to sleep. I could feel my father's presence because I was right in the spot where he had died. They believe he had a heart attack while lying on the couch, tried to get off the couch to call for help but fell on the floor and died. No one else was home when it happened. I was on the couch when this happened. I thought, this is stupid. People don't leave essences behind. I'm not feeling anything. Then I said out loud, "If this is really you, Dad, knock a box of cereal off the shelf onto the floor." I picked something I didn't think could happen by accident. I went into the kitchen and watched the shelf with the cereal on it for a few minutes and nothing happened. Since it was almost midnight, I decided to sleep in my old bedroom. The next morning, I went downstairs and a box of cereal was lying on the floor. I asked my mother, "Did you knock that cereal onto the floor?" She said no, it was like that when she woke up. So what the heck? My mother had a cat, so it could have been the cat. But if the cat had gotten on the shelf, everything would have been knocked around and messy. Everything else was in its normal position. Only the box of cereal was on the floor. Could have been the cat, but I'm not sure. My mother also told me, months before this, that she felt my father get in bed with her one night after he died. She said, "Go away, Greg. You're dead. You don't need to go to bed anymore." And she felt him get out of the bed after that. My mother despised my father by the end of his life, though they remained married. So it is not surprising she told him to get the hell out. Story 16. The night my friend took his own life, I had a sudden urge to call him. I was in Canada and he was in Atlanta at the time. I did not call because I was out partying with friends. I got the news the next day when I woke up. I feel like I missed the chance to save a friend, but my dad says it was his way of letting me know he was gone and that he would be okay. I'm sorry I did not reach out, bud. I regret it all the time. Story 17. I have quite a few, but one recent incident stands out. I grew up in a very rural area, mostly crop farms. About a mile from my parents' house, there was an old abandoned farmhouse that all the local kids said was haunted. They would sneak into the house after dark, the typical stupid kid stuff, but I believe there are things better left alone and never went in. Years passed. The house fell into disrepair and was eventually torn down, leaving an old weathered barn. I make a little side money selling photos of abandoned places, so I wanted to photograph the barn. I parked on the road and started up the drive. I made it about 10 feet before I could not go any further. My feet would not move, adrenaline surged, and I broke into tears. I turned back and ran to my car. I did not feel safe until I got past a nearby creek you have to cross to get there. I tried to let it go, but a few months later we drove past the property after Christmas dinner with my parents and there was a creature standing in the drive. It reminded me of the faun from Pan's Labyrinth. Super tall with a wide head and horns or antlers, but its eyes were more on the sides of its head. Adrenaline hit again and I started crying, but I tried to stay calm because I did not want to alarm my kids. My husband asked if I was okay. I just said, "You saw that, right?" "Yep." "Was it human?" "Nope." I refused to drive that road ever again. Story 18. My mother told me two stories. Once her doctor changed her blood pressure medication, which caused her to pass out on the kitchen floor. She had a near-death experience similar to what many people describe. A tunnel of light, deceased family members appearing, and an incredible feeling of joy. My uncle, her brother, was about 10 years older. In the 1960s, he often sailed from Florida to the Bahamas. One day, he left on the boat and vanished. Shortly afterward, while she was at work, the phone rang. A woman asked if she was Carol. She said yes. The woman said that her brother had died an honorable death, and then hung up. Story 19. I used to work at a Boy Scout camp. My cabin was the furthest from the center of camp, about 2 miles from everyone else. One night, I was walking down the trail at 3 a.m. Through the shadows, I saw a hand reach out to grab me. I panicked, took out my pocket knife, and stabbed at it. Then there was silence. The hand was gone and my knife hung in the air. I ran back to my cabin as fast as I could. Story 20. I was out with my parents, and it was late returning home. At around 2:30 a.m. We were at a traffic signal when a homeless man came and knocked on the window next to where my mother was sitting. As she rolled down the window to give him money, he said, "Check what is happening at your brother's house." He took the money and walked away. Probably thinking he was a bit crazy, we didn't bother and went home. The next morning, my mother received a call from her brother's wife. He had a heart attack at 2:30 a.m. Story 21. My son, now 10, was 4 and was able to name my grandmother by name from a picture of her in her 20s that my mother and I were going through in storage. She died before my wife and I met. He said she was the woman who taught him his silly laugh. His silly laugh sounded just like my grandmother's. The reason it was so specific and odd was that my grandmother had a brain aneurysm when my mother was in her teens. It paralyzed the left side of her body, including her vocal cords and lips, and gave her a very distinct, unusual laugh. Story 22. When I was a kid, about 10 to 12, I was carrying a load of laundry upstairs by myself while my mom was out running errands. We had a weird carpet runner over the hardwood stairs that was attached only at the top of the flight and not secured to each stair. I stepped on an air bubble of carpet with my vision obscured by the laundry and fell backward while bare hugging a bunch of blankets. I specifically remember thinking, well, guess I'm about to die, while almost airborne with just my big toe left on the carpet when I felt two hands, one on either side of my shoulder blades, give me a firm shove that launched me back up onto the step and diagonally against the stair railing. I assumed my mom had come back early without announcing herself, and I turned to thank her while still clinging to the railing, but no one was there. I scurried upstairs to set my things down, calling her name, and then checked the house to see if any doors were unlocked or if her car was in the driveway. I finally called her cell phone, and she told me she was still visiting a few more stores. It still feels like there is a presence on that stairwell, like someone is watching in a protective way rather than a sinister one. Edit. Thanks for all the awards. I'll have to holler to the stairway ghost and let it know the internet loves it. Story 23. I live in one city, and my brother lives in another city about 1,000 kilometers away. He visits sometimes, but not often. On average, about once every 2 years. One day, about 7 years ago, I was sleeping on the couch in the living room of my apartment. I woke up suddenly to find my brother sitting beside me. I was shocked and surprised. I greeted him, asked how he was doing, and said what a pleasant surprise it was. Then I realized it had been a dream when the doorbell rang and woke me. I went to open the door, and it was my brother who had come to surprise us. This left me speechless. I do not have any explanation, and I think sometimes you do not need one. Story 24. I once had a dream about my high school best friend who had moved out of state and started a family. I had not seen or spoken to her in at least 10 years and had never met her child, only seen pictures and posts on Facebook and commented on them. In the dream, I was walking down a street at night when, out of nowhere, her little girl appeared beside me. I asked, "Where's your mama? Why are you by yourself?" She led me to some bushes near a random house and I found my friend in bad shape on the ground. I remember running to the door of the house, screaming for help and asking someone to call the police. That is all I can recall, although there may have been more. The next day, I woke up thinking that was strange. Maybe I dreamed of her because we had recently exchanged a few comments on Facebook. I thought I should send her a message. I went about my day, worked, and later that evening I sat on my couch scrolling through Facebook. Suddenly there were 1,000 posts saying, "Rest in peace," and similar messages, all tagging my friend and her daughter. I thought, what the actual fuck? At that point there was no information about what had happened, so I assumed it must have been a car accident. Over the next few weeks and months more information emerged, and it was not an accident. My friend and her sweet baby had been murdered by someone I refused to call a person. This happened about 5 years ago. I still remember the main parts of the dream vividly, and I am still horrified that I had it the night it may have been happening. I have not been able to tell anyone about it because just thinking about it gives me chills. Story 25. A couple of years ago, my father's immediate family had a reunion in Minnesota. We stayed at a little cabin on a lake. Sitting around the campfire, my uncle told us all his ghost stories, which put me a bit on edge. Later, when I went back to my room to sleep, I flipped off the light switch and immediately both closet doors popped open. Panicked. Story 26. I worked as night security for a small office at a sanitation plant. The building had a single entrance, and you had to check in at the security station to enter or exit. One night, a worker checked in saying he needed to take care of a few things and collect some items. I checked his identification, turned on a few lights for him, and went back to my duties. A few hours later, as my shift was about to end, I had not seen the worker return. I patrolled the building but could not find him. He was not in any of the areas where I had turned on lights, no other lights were on, and he was not in any rooms. I returned to the security station but nobody was there. I checked the cameras and he appeared only on the camera covering the entrance and security station. He turned down a hallway and never appeared on the next camera down that hall. I logged it as an incident and left immediately when the relief shift arrived. The next day my boss called and said that the worker had been on vacation out of state for several days and would not return for several more. Nobody could explain what happened. Story 27. I was home alone in high school. It looked like car headlights were shining through our kitchen door, which didn't make sense because the house was next to a field. I looked out and saw the lights about 50 feet off the ground. They were a row of 3 white lights and 1 red light. I opened the door. There was complete silence and the whole field was lit up. I closed the door quickly, turned around, and it was gone. Story 28. I saw a small unidentified flying object in the forest with my son. It was completely silent and pulsating an odd bluish-white light as it wove slowly through the trees. Story 29. In 2010, my family and I lived in a nice house in the woods. Strange, unexplainable things happened there. One day, I was coming up the stairs from the basement, and as I rounded the corner, I saw a shadowy figure running from the main floor to the top floor. I only saw it from the corner of my eye, and it was gone in an instant. A couple of years later, I had moved on to college, and my parents decided to sell the house to downsize. They had just finished repainting most of the walls, and I asked my cousin to take a picture so I could see how the new paint looked. She took the picture from the back of the living room facing the front of the house, where the staircase was on the right. In the picture was the same shadow I had seen the year before. She was the only person in the house when the picture was taken, and the shadow appears to be looking directly at the camera. I have the picture posted in my profile history if anyone wants to see it. Story 30. When my great-grandfather passed away, my aunt and uncle found an unopened voicemail on their landline answering machine. When they listened, it sounded exactly like my great-grandfather saying, "God help me," before it faded. The strangest part is that when they requested a log of incoming and outgoing calls, there were no calls logged for that time frame. I have heard the voicemail. So strange. Story 31. I posted this a year and a half ago, but I'll tell it again. I need to give a bit of background. When I was little, the woman who cleaned my house while my parents were working, whom I will call Mary, was also my babysitter. After she finished cleaning, she would often take me to her house until my mother came to pick me up. Over the years, I got to know her whole family, including her husband, whom I will call Dave. Dave was a nice man, the kind you would find in a rural town. He liked to drink wine with his friends at the bar, go hunting, and tell interesting stories. After all those years, he basically considered me a grandson. When the coronavirus disease 2019 first hit my country, I had a dream one night in which Mary came to my house to clean as usual, but this time there was a closed black coffin in the living room. When I asked what was inside, she looked at me and said sadly, "Dave is inside there." That night, I woke up and felt a presence beside my bed. Half asleep, I remember saying, "Come on, Dave. Let me get back to sleep." The next morning, my parents told me that Mary had called to say Dave had died that night from complications of coronavirus disease 2019. To this day, I have not told anyone about the dream, and I am still a bit freaked out by the whole story. Sorry for the format and grammar, but I am on mobile and English is not my first language. Story 32. When my daughter was about 10, she joined a softball league and I, as her father, taught her how to throw, hit, and field. I took her to a local AAA minor league game. I had never been to the stadium before. It seated about 16,000 people. The seats I purchased were down the third baseline, about as far away from home plate as you can get and still be inside the stadium. As the game progressed, she saw foul balls go into the stands and after a while asked if you could keep one if you caught it. I told her yes, and she said, "Catch me one, Daddy." I spent a few minutes explaining why that was very unlikely to happen where we were. As I was finishing breaking her heart, I heard a bat crack, looked up, and saw a long, towering fly ball. I knew immediately from my years playing baseball that this one was coming to me. All I had to do was stand, raise my glove hand to my right ear because I am left-handed, and the ball landed perfectly in the webbing. The crowd cheered. 25 years later, I still have the memory of my daughter's face as I gave it to her. When I think about all the factors that had to come together for that to happen, a left-handed batter, the right pitch and swing, the poorly chosen seating, and that I had even found and brought my old glove, it affirmed my belief that there is a higher power that sometimes grants small miracles. This was a AAA team one step below the majors. I doubt there is a single A team in the country that plays in a stadium this large. Story 33. My grandfather died when I was 7, but in his own words, I was his absolute favorite, partly because I am the spitting image of his mother even into adulthood. When I was 21, I was about to give birth to my first son. As my husband and I entered the elevator to the labor and delivery unit, a man came in and said he was a volunteer and would help us find our way. The elevator was slow, and we spent the time talking about what a blessing children are and how they grow up so fast. He looked and sounded exactly like my grandfather. The same stature, The same blue-gray eyes, the same faint Scottish-Canadian accent, the same khakis, checked shirt, and sky-blue cardigan. Even spookier, the nurses said they do not have any older male volunteers in that particular building. I do not really believe in ghosts, but I am absolutely certain my grandfather paid me a visit that night. Story 34. The only way I can explain this is wishful thinking. My mother and father were codependent, and they liked it that way. They did not want other people around except the children. They were completely happy to be wrapped up in each other. My father died the day before his birthday in a hospice center. Afterwards, it was like he was still home. His touch lamp beside his recliner would go on by itself. The recliner would rock as if someone were getting into it. Sometimes my mother or my sister would hear my father say, "Honey, fix me a cold drink?" That was exactly how he asked my mother to fill his massive mug with Sprite over ice. My mother died less than a year and a half later. After she died, there was never another sign of either of them being there. They have been gone for close to 14 years. Story 35. When I was traveling to my family's home in Bangladesh, I rode in a sport utility vehicle along a highway that ran through a forest. I sat in the front passenger seat. About 2 hours into the drive, we saw an old man hitchhiking along the road, and the driver stopped to pick him up. He insisted on sitting in my seat, so I gave it to him out of respect. About an hour later, our vehicle collided with a bus. The front passenger seat was mangled. We all got out and searched, but the man who had taken my seat was nowhere to be found. There was no blood. He had been wearing traditional attire, which was not unusual for the area. He had not spoken during the ride except to tell us to drop him off at the market in the town where my family lived, and to insist on taking my seat. He spoke Bengali in an old-fashioned style, the kind found in 19th century poetry. I assumed he was an ascetic. I have pictures of the collision. Story 36. When I was about 6 years old, I was walking down the stairs. No one was behind me, and suddenly I felt a chill and a faint hand on my shoulder before I was pushed down the stairs. I was all right. Only a few cuts and bruises, nothing serious, but I still remember the feeling of the invisible hand on my shoulder. It haunts me. Story 37. I was 15 and trying to sleep but having an asthma attack. Late that night, I heard rhythmic breathing coming from the floor next to my bed. It was not scary. It was comforting. It was not me because my breathing sounded much worse than that. The sound helped me calm down and fall asleep, even though I was still sick, and I managed to get an inhaler in the morning. At the time, I thought it was a friendly ghost. Later, I rationalized that I might have been hearing a family member through the heating ducts. Years later, after I had a dog, I realized the sound was exactly like a big dog sleeping next to the bed. Now I am 50-50 on whether a ghost dog visited me, or my dog time traveled back about 10 years before she was born to comfort me. Story 38. My friend and I left college at 4 in the afternoon and walked the usual route home, a 20-minute walk that included a country lane. We did not stop or detour, but we arrived at my house at 7 in the evening. About 2 hours and 40 minutes had simply disappeared. We have never been able to explain what happened. Story 39. One night I had a dream about my grandfather, who had died almost 20 years earlier. We were in his home and he kept telling me we needed to clean and get the house ready. When I asked him why, he said that she is coming home. My grandmother, his wife of 50 years, died the next day. Story 40. I had a premonition that I would be involved in a car accident the morning I got out of bed to go to work. It was a very strange thought, and I considered taking an alternative route but did not. When I got onto the highway, it was raining, and a car hydroplaned and slammed into my vehicle. Story 41. My siblings and I all had the same dream on the same night exactly 1 year after my mom died. In the dream, she was in the same place and spoke to us, reassuring us that she was okay, that she was with her mother and our deceased siblings, and that her father was in a bad place. The next day, we realized we had all had the same dream. We even independently drew pictures of the place we had seen and wrote down the name it resembled. Most of my siblings took it as a message from our mom, but my youngest sister and I prefer to think we developed some low-level telepathy. Story 42. I was in college walking to class. As I started to cross a busy street, a hand grabbed my shoulder quite hard and stopped me. Car zoomed by and would have killed me. There was nobody behind me or anywhere close enough to have stopped me. Was it a guardian angel? Story 43. A little late, but here goes. When I was in middle school, my grandparents were in charge of the local theater group, and we were doing a musical show where people dressed up as old country stars and sang songs. My grandmother was the director, and my grandfather handled technical things like lights and sound. This particular performance was on Elvis Presley's birthday, and they had a small bit at the end where they sang "Happy Birthday" in costume. The show ended and everyone was doing curtain call. I was sitting in the back with my grandfather while he was controlling the lights and sound when, all of a sudden, "Happy Birthday" by the Beatles started playing over the speakers. My grandfather looked confused and started messing with the soundboard, pressing buttons and turning dials. My grandmother ran back, yelling that it was not the song he was supposed to play. He looked up and said, "That's not me." She replied, "What do you mean? Switch it to the right song." He looked even more confused and said, "We don't even have this song on compact disc for the play. This isn't coming from our music." My grandmother just turned around and left. The whole song played and ended when the curtain closed. No one in the audience seemed to notice, and it felt normal, but it still unnerves me. We inspected the compact disc that contained all the music for the play and was in the computer during the performance, and sure enough, that song was not on it. I still think the ghost of Elvis was there that night. Story 44. Very minor, but I still go, what the fuck? When I was a kid, around 6, I lived in a very arid area, and a wide field of red dirt lay between my house and my friends. Every day as I walked over there, when I got about halfway across, I would pick up a dirt clod or a small rock and toss it behind me over my shoulder. About 10 seconds later, it would come flying back over my head and land in front of me. I would just grin and keep walking. I remember this distinctly, even trying to replicate it later in childhood after I had moved away and being sad that it didn't work anymore. I didn't question it as a kid, but looking back it was just strange. Also, my job site is haunted, but this seems stranger. Story 45. Apparently we lived with a benign spirit in our house for 3.5 years. This is my mother's account because my sister and I did not see anything at the time. Only my brother, his best friend, and my mother saw it. When we lived in South Africa, we had moved into an apartment we had bought. Moving in was eventful because a mother and her son had been renting the place and, although they had been notified, they decided to stay past the given date. I was around 7 or 8, so I do not know the details. Long story short, we moved in and started settling. After putting us to bed, my mother stayed up to watch television. My brother was out with his friends. As she watched, she glanced at our only plant in the house, about 1.5 meters tall, and saw a man roughly the same height standing under one of its leaves. Startled, she switched the lights on. He was not there. She called it a night and went to bed. The next day, or maybe 2 days later, at breakfast, my brother, who was about 16, picked up a piece of bread, turned to the plant and laughed. "Hey Michael, want some?" My mother asked who Michael was. He said, "Michael's the guy standing under the plant at night." My mother had not told anyone about Michael to avoid frightening us. My brother's best friend was also there, and my mother asked him if he saw Michael too. He said yes and gave a perfect description down to the whites of his eyes. Michael apparently was a young black man about 1.4 to 1.5 meters in height, wearing plain black trousers, a white button-down shirt, and a green vest. His skin tone was very dark with a faint sheen. His eyes were a dark honey color, and the whites were slightly yellowed. He had a permanent smiling expression that did not reach his eyes. He stayed where he was, never moving but following you with his eyes. One morning my mother woke up when my father arrived home with an indoor water circulator. He moved the plant to the opposite side of the room, next to the couch, and placed the circulator where the plant had been. That night Michael moved with the plant. I asked why my mother did not simply throw the plant away. She said that it never occurred to her. So that is the story of Michael, the benign smiling spirit who was part of our family for some time. Later, my mother told me that Michael's eyes were a dark honey color. How I forgot such a creepy detail is beyond me. Story 46. While working at the City Tavern in Old City, Philadelphia, considered one of the most haunted buildings in the United States, I saw a full dinner service, plates, utensils, and glasses fly off a table we called the Big Round in the middle of service. They did not just tip over. They were flung from the table as if pushed. I witnessed this twice, once during a slow service with no one seated at the table. It happened often enough that servers and even some customers came to expect it. I am sure there is a logical explanation, perhaps a specific vibration from a subway, except the train does not run under the historic district. When opening, the building sometimes sounded as if many people were inside, even when only a few of us were there. The building is large with many stairwells and dumbwaiters, so it may be an acoustic effect. We felt sudden icy drafts, noticed shifting furniture, and experienced other typical haunted house phenomena. Ask anyone who worked there. The place is genuinely spooky at times. Sadly, Chef Walter Stabe, the last proprietor, had to close the tavern because of the coronavirus pandemic and will not be reopening. This was only the second time the tavern has closed in its 250-year history. Story 47. In high school, I was being pressured by my peers to do something I did not want to do. I would have gotten in a lot of trouble if a teacher had come by, but I felt I had no choice. I distinctly remember thinking, if I have a guardian angel right now, please fucking pull the fire alarm or something. At that exact second, the fire alarm went off. This had never happened at the school. It was so unlikely I did not expect it. I nearly soiled myself. We immediately went to the assembly area with the rest of the school, and I got out of the situation. It turned out someone in the school had accidentally triggered the fire alarm. I spent the rest of the day in shock. I don't know if this counts as supernatural, but what are the chances? That day introduced me to the idea of guardian angels, and since then I have had many similar occasions when, just in the nick of time, I escaped potentially very bad situations, either due to insane luck or the nudge of something looking out for me. The thing I did not want to do was smoke. My friends wanted to smoke marijuana. I had strict parents, and the school had strict drug policies with immediate expulsion. I had never used drugs before and was scared and very uncomfortable. I wish it had been something cooler and less lame. Story 48. A family friend of ours, Gary, was terminally ill with cancer. He was a father figure to me and one of the few adult males from my previous life, as I am a recovering alcoholic who fully understood me. A friend and I were in Moab, Utah, and found a hostel to sleep in for the night. I had a dream about Gary. He looked amazing, completely healthy, backlit, and was wearing a multicolored sweater. He looked at me with concern in his eyes, pointed backward, and said, "I am not doing too good." I woke up a bit shaken because it felt so real. I told my girlfriend about the dream, and she asked if I needed to call my mother to see how he was doing. I told her that it was not necessary because I knew they would call me if Gary passed. That day we drove from Utah to Colorado and stayed in another hotel. Around 5 a.m., I woke up to my phone ringing. I could see that it was my mother, and I already knew what she was going to tell me. She broke the news that Gary had passed, and I explained to her that Gary came and told me goodbye. I am tearing up in real life right now writing this. The picture his wife picked for his obituary was of Gary in that multicolored sweater he wore when he came to me in my dream. Story 49. Not scary, but still not explainable. When I was 22, I visited my grandma in her retirement home at Christmas. She was well, nothing out of the ordinary. A few days later, I traveled to my then boyfriend across the country. 2 days after New Year's, I woke up at 2 a.m. crying. I just could not stop. I was not really sad or overly emotional, but the tears just kept streaming down my face. Nothing like that had ever happened, and I was confused, as was my boyfriend. I fell back asleep a few hours later. 3 days later, I was informed that my grandma had died that night at about 2 a.m. Due to my parents' divorce, communication was difficult, and we were only informed after the funeral. I do not believe in anything supernatural, but it is hard to wrap my head around, especially since nothing like this ever happened again. Story 50. One night, while I was walking my dog, His leash broke. He ran away, frightened, into the dark, and I could not find him. I searched for him until 3 a.m., but he had disappeared. I walked home and told my mother that my dog was missing. That night, my mother had a dream in which she saw exactly where the dog was. The next morning, I went to the place she had seen, and sure enough, my dog was there. Story 51. I have many, but here is the first that popped into my head. I was driving home from work after picking up my baby late at night. There were not many cars on the country roads. The one stoplight there was red for me, so I stopped. It turned green, and I had a sudden voice or thought in my head saying, "Do not go yet." There was nothing coming. I was still sitting at the green light. Just as I released the brake, a semi-truck came flying through its red light. I was shaken. Story 52. I dreamed the sequel to The Matrix years before it was released. I do not think it had been announced yet. The scene where Neo fights countless Agent Smiths in the playground was exactly as I had described it to my wife after the dream, and we were both taken aback to see it on screen. What a useless glimpse of the future. Story 53. A red luminescent ball flew along the horizon. It moved like nothing we had ever seen, zipping around at an incredible speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. About 20 of us watched it. Some of the kids asked me what I thought it was, since I had grown up around aviation with my dad. I told them that, since I could not identify it, it was essentially an unidentified flying object. I explained that this did not mean aliens. It simply meant that what we saw did not match any aircraft I knew, then or now. It could have been ball lightning, but it was kilometers away above the horizon, glowing in the dusk sunlight. Story 54. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother looked through old family photos and asked me who the people were. We came to a picture of my grandfather, and she asked who he was. I said, Poppy Jim. He had died suddenly at home when my mother was 10, in the same house we lived in, so I never met him. My grandmother asked how I knew that, and I told her. He comes and tucks me in and tells me he loves me sometimes after you go to bed. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.